Good evening again, everyone. I'm Paul Kagabine at the Garland County Library, and tonight we have our latest installment in the Garland County Master Gardeners Know It to Grow It program. Tonight's program is all about mosses and is presented by Jodi Tooke, who is a very prominent member of the Garland County Master Gardeners herself, and she'll be given a more formal introduction here in a moment. But first of all, if you have any questions or comments for Jodi during this presentation, as always, you can just drop them there in the comment section live. And if you weren't able or you're not able to finish this live, there will be a recording of this broadcast available on the library's Facebook and YouTube channels that you can watch again or share with your friends. So please do that. But before we switch over to Jodi Tooke, we're going to first welcome Judy Dare, who is the chairperson with the Garland County Master Gardener. So welcome, Judy.
Thank you very much, and hello everyone, and welcome to Know It to Grow It. It's really surprising that it's been a month already since we met last, and I'm really glad that you're here. Tonight's program is Moss, Mystery in a Modern World, and I can't think of a more appropriate program with all this rain that we've had. I'm sure that we'll all be able to go out and identify some specimens in our own yard after we hear Jodi's talk. I also want to thank everybody for coming out to the Garland County Master Gardener plant sale. It was a huge success, and we were so happy to see everyone there. So thank you so much for coming out and supporting us. Now, next month, you're going to think I'm crazy, but next month's Know It to Grow It is all about irrigation. So yes, the rain will stop one day, and we will get tired of lugging water to our plants. So James Moore Jr. and Doc Sedler will have a program on June the 22nd. It's at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday, so please put that down in your calendar, 3 o'clock. And they're going to be taking us through irrigation from the box to a garden, and we're actually going to have a garden tour where the system is set up and you'll be able to see it work. So I think that's going to be really fun in June, and maybe by then we will have dried out some. Also remember, if you're having any problem with your plants or wonder what your soil needs, please remember that the Garland County Extension Service, it resides at 236 Woodbine, and you can take samples of your plants, you can take dirt samples in, soil samples in, and have them look and see what you might need and maybe why your plants aren't doing so well. So please remember, we're having door prizes. The first 3 people who comment or question will get a door prize, and they will be available after 12 noon at the library tomorrow. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Jodi Tooke. Jodi Tooke is a volunteer with the Garland County Master Gardeners and many more organizations. In 2014, she retired from the Air Force after 28 years and lives on Lake Hamilton with her husband, Sam. She is fascinated by what grows well and not so well, and also thinks of her landscape as an experiment, and I totally get that. She became a master gardener in 2015 to learn about plants and what makes them special, and also help others understand why they're special. She finds finding the right plant for the right space is very important, and she enjoys exploring the native plants, invasive species, and also traditional ornamentals that you can use in your yard, coming to terms with why and how they prosper, because as we all know, not everything does well here in Arkansas or in a particular place in your yard. Her interest in weeds and mosses comes from wanting to understand the environment she lives in Arkansas, and understands Arkansas native flora and fauna. So without further ado, please welcome Jodi Tooke.
Well, thank you, Judy, for that marvelous introduction. And I am so happy to be here sharing my passion for mosses that grew out of a curiosity for why they grew where they did and how to encourage them in my own landscape. Although I'm a master gardener, I am self-educated, and I'm still very much an amateur gardener and scientist. Mosses are still mysterious to me because I struggle with naming them. It can be really hard. I recently listened to a talk by Karen Willard. She is a botanical expert, and she reminded us that you may not be able to identify mosses, but you can still appreciate them. So we're going to be putting up a slide presentation, and Paul, if you can get that started for us. And there it is. And if you notice that that kind of fence there is in my yard, and it's that treated wood that supposedly things aren't supposed to grow on it. And you can see the moss has still kind of found a home on that treated wood, and it kind of varies with seasons and with moisture, and so it's just a wonderful way to look at things. Most of the pictures in my presentation will either be from my yard or they'll be credited to the source where I got it. Next slide, please. So join me as we venture into the mystery of mosses, how they grow, where they thrive, and what makes them special. We'll learn today how to identify some basic examples that grow right here in Arkansas. And I want to start with just a short excerpt from Elizabeth Gilbert's book, The Signature of All Things. In her character, Alma, she captures the passion of a young scientist discovering a whole new world through her attuned senses. Viewing the picture on your screen, just imagine yourself beside her. Alma knelt in the tall grass and brought her face as near as she could to the stone. And there, rising no more than an inch above the surface of the boulder, she saw a great and tiny forest. Nothing moved within the mossy world. She peered at it so closely that she could smell it, dank and rich and old. Gently, Alma pressed her hand into this tight little timberland. It compacted itself under her palm and then sprang back to form without complaint. There was something stirring about its response to her. The moss felt warm and spongy, several degrees warmer than the air around it, and far more damp than she had expected. It appeared to have its own weather. Alma put the magnifying lens to her eye and looked again. Now the miniature forest below her gaze sprang into majestic detail. She felt her breath catch. This was a stupefying kingdom. This was the Amazon jungle as seen from the back of a harpy eagle. She rode her eye above the landscape, following its paths in every direction. Here were rich, abundant valleys filled with tiny trees of braided mermaid hair and minuscule, tangled vines. Here were barely visible tributaries running through that jungle. And here was a miniature ocean in a depression in the center of the boulder where all the water pooled. Just across this ocean, which was half the size of Alma's shawl, she found another continent of moss altogether. On this new continent, everything was different. This corner of the boulder must receive more sunlight than the other, she surmised, or slightly less rain. In any case, this was a new climate entirely. Here the moss grew in mountain ranges the length of Alma's arms, in elegant pine tree-shaped clusters of danker, more somber green. On another quadrant of the same boulder still, she found patches of infinitesimally small deserts, inhabited by some kind of sturdy, dry, flaking moss that had the appearance of cactus. Elsewhere, she found deep, diminutive fords, so deep that incredibly, even now in the month of June, the mosses within were still chilled by lingering traces of winter ice. But she also found warm estuaries, miniature cathedrals, and limestone caves the size of her thumb. Then Alma lifted her face and saw what was before her. Dozens more such boulders, more than she could count, each one similarly carpeted, each one subtly different. She felt herself growing breathless. This was the entire world. This was bigger than a world. This was the firmament of the universe as seen through one of William Herschel's mighty telescopes. This was planetary and vast. These were ancient, unexplored galaxies rolling forth in front of her, and it was all right here. Next slide, please. So just to kind of get you warmed up to mosses, we're going to define those mosses. We'll look at how they grow, where they thrive, and how to look at a moss, how to kind of tell what it is, how it's been classified. And then some that we find in Arkansas. And then I'll leave you with a list of references so that you can continue exploring this mystical world on your own. Next slide, please. So, mosses are part of the species of bryophytes, and there's over 12,000 different species. These are a group of seedless plants without specialized water-conducting tissues, and it includes, among mosses, liverworts and hornworts. You've seen them perched atop a rock and along cracks in the sidewalk or at the base of a tree in damp environments. They're small, green, and herbaceous, meaning that there's no woody stem above the ground. The leaves are arranged spirally around a tiny stem that facilitates passing water and nutrients in a really primitive example of a vascular system. The root is a rhizoid. It absorbs no water or nutrients, but it just serves as an anchor to keep the plant in place. Water and nutrient essentials come from rainfall or dew and windborne debris absorbed through their leaves. Without moisture, the plant shrivels up and looks dead, but it revives quickly when it's rehydrated. Moss harvests carbon dioxide and sunlight to create food by photosynthesis. And they also begin soil formation, and they contribute to the stabilization of a new environment. Mosses also provide habitats for small insects, nesting material, and food. Reproduction is the biggest feature differentiating these primitive plants from higher plants. While they reproduce using spores, like ferns, they do so with single unpaired chromosomes that pair with a compatible partner during reproduction and then release those spores from reproductive capsules. And we'll get a look at what all that looks like. So there are no seeds, there are no flowers, and it's just this green little plant that kind of grows in places where most other things have trouble growing. Next slide, please. So this is a patch of moss, and it shows both the gametophytes, and that's that low kind of form at the kind of the green part that looks sort of like ferns, and sporophytes, and that's the tall stalk-like forms circled there. Those release the spores. You can see at the base, kind of tangled underneath the brownish color, those are the rhizoids, and that's what anchors the plant in place. Next slide, please. So mosses are very primitive plants, again, with higher evolved, with vascular systems. They're limited to energy productions by 3 factors: moisture, sunlight, and a temperature above 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Specific species of moss can be extremely difficult to maintain away from their natural sites with their unique combinations of light, humidity, substrate chemistry, shelter from the wind, etc. So there's kind of these little microclimates where they do really well. They grow on materials that are porous and moisture retentive, such as brick, wood, and certain coarse concrete mixtures. Surfaces can also be prepared with acidic substances, including buttermilk, yogurt, urine, and gently pureed mixtures of moss samples, water, and other compost. Mosses are evergreen plants. They will grow year-round as long as moisture and sunlight are available at the same time. Photosynthesis is possible even below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Mosses do not have seasonal growth habitats. Instead, their dormancy comes anytime that they're dry. They return to active growth just as soon as moisture refills their tissues. And in a really nice carpet that you see there on the screen, it will control weeds because there won't be any room for that weed to kind of get through that carpet of moss. Next slide, please. So mosses thrive in a wide variety of locations, and you can kind of see a few examples here. It needs to be damp enough and have enough sunlight for the moss to conduct photosynthesis. It needs to have kind of enough calmness, like it can't be too windy either, because the wind can affect the way a moss behaves as well. The substrate needs to be porous with low competition, and this would include rocks, exposed mineral soil, even disturbed soils. They tend to like acidic soils.
Uh-oh, we seem to have lost Jodi there. Judy, maybe you could contact her while we take a little, we stall for just a moment. Oh, there she is. She figured it. Welcome
I think
back,
I got kicked off. Okay, I'm back. Sorry. I don't know what happened. So like I talked about the substrates, they like the acidic soils, cliff seeps, waterfall spray areas, trunks, tree branches, or even in bogs. They'll grow on trees, but they are not parasitic. They'll grow in cracks between paving stones, in damp city streets, and on roofs, as you see in the photo there. Next slide, please. So here you can see other examples. You see the picture there. I have a concrete pot, and the moss grows right in that little corner. Areas where mosses won't grow on any galvanized or zinc-plated metals. They don't like copper. They tend to not grow on pressure-treated lumber or anything that's chemically unstable. Next slide, please. So this is a picture of my backyard, two very contrasting environments. You can see on the right-hand side, the moss growing really well at the base of a tree. It's very, very shady there. In fact, I don't think it ever gets any direct sunlight. On the left is kind of this reddish rock. I'm not even sure what it's made of. It's just in my yard, and it gets sun almost constantly, almost all day long. And yet there's moss that grows on that rock. So two very different environments and two very different mosses. Next slide, please. And again, kind of showing that the loose gravel on the right there, there's a moss that kind of actually grows in between those rocks and is very happy in that kind of setting. And on the left, the moss has kind of nestled itself into the crevice of that rock. So again, two kind of very different environments, but still the moss finds a way to thrive. Next slide, please. So how do we look at mosses? First and foremost, when you look at a moss, take a look at the surroundings. What is the environment where it's living? What kind of things is it growing on? Is it on a tree? Is it on a rock? Is it on decaying logs? You have to look at where it's growing. Is it next to a stream? So kind of observe its surroundings. Then observe it wet and dry. I recommend taking like a little spray bottle, the kind that you use on houseplants, maybe just one that you can fit easily in your hand, and observe the moss wet and dry. And it can be, if the moss is kind of dry, not a day like today, obviously, you can put your hand over a portion of it and spray it so that you can get the wet and dry right next to each other, so that you could kind of see the wet and the dry moss and how it looks different. And that'll help you identify it. If the moss is wet, you can kind of take just a small sprig of that moss and kind of hold it in the air, and it'll dry out fairly quickly. So there are three key features of mosses. First is its growth form, and second, the leaf shape, and third, the midrib. I found this book called Common Mosses of Northeastern Appalachians. In fact, a friend of mine recommended it to me, and it has just some really awesome methodologies for how to identify moss. And those are the methodologies I'll share today. The pictures in that book are great. They show close-ups and they show the moss from a distance. And it also shows some microscopic views of the mosses. And so it kind of really helps you understand what the plant looks like. And it also includes identification keys for anybody who kind of has identified other things. Those are descriptions that kind of lead you down different paths based on what you see, and it walks you through each of those key features. So it really helps you to identify the moss. Next slide, please. So when we talk about growth form, Pleurocarpus mosses have a prostate growth habit. And as defined by encyclopedia.com, it is a type of moss in which the female sex organs and capsules are borne on short lateral branches, not at the tips of the branches. Pleurocarpus mosses tend to form spreading carpets rather than erect tufts. So the pleurocarps are freely branching in a chaotic fashion. Pleurocarps spread out branches from the colony in a creeping fashion. and the sporophytes of the Pleurocarpus emerge mid-stem. They grow faster than the Acrocarpus, and they quickly regenerate from broken fragments. Pleurocarpus are quick to attach to stone, and their growth rate makes them really good for colonizing hard substrates. Maintenance of Pleurocarpus is easier due to their matting tendencies and low, even profile, and blowing debris off them is much easier as well. They can be nurseries for Acrocarpus. Once an area is colonized by these pioneer mosses, the slower growing Acrocarpus can more easily colonize. Now, Acrocarpus mosses, pictured there on the right, have an upright growth habit. And as defined by encyclopedia.com, Acrocopress moss is a type of moss in which the female sex organs, and hence the capsules, are borne at the tips of the stems and branches. They may branch extensively, and once they have fruited, the branches take over the erect growth. They're usually unbranched and erect, forming a mounded colony. They are slow growing, and the sporophytes of the Acrocarpus emerge from the tips of the plant. The Acrocarpus do not regenerate from fragments as quickly as the Pleurocarpus, and weeds are much less likely to invade due to the thickness of the tightly packed stems. Next slide, please. I'll also talk a little bit about peat or Spango moss. This is kind of a third growth form. The stems stand upright with branches in clusters of 3 or more. It retains water, and it conditions soil and is used extensively in the horticultural industry. Just to give you an example of kind of exactly how much this absorption rate is, I have a note there that some Spango mosses can absorb up to 20 times their weight in water. Cotton fibers retain 5 to 6 times their weight in water. So Spango moss can be harvested on a sustainable basis and managed so that regrowth is allowed. It has a very neutral pH and is a soft, pliable growing material with long fibers. It is pure moss. There is some harvesting that can cause environmental damage, and sometimes when they scrape all of the peat, they kind of cut it out of the bog. It tends to be acidic and high in tannins. So since it's being stripped out of its environment, it has no chance to recover. It's compacted and usually sold in compressed bales. And it contains a mixture of organic materials, including the moss, decaying plant matter, and dead insects. Next slide, please. So leaf shape is the second identification key. On the left, you see the Pleurocarpus, and they will either be the sickle, the lance, ovate, or the tongue. And you can see the shapes there. And the sickle is triangular, kind of oval-shaped, and they taper to a point, and they'll kind of flop over to one side or the other. The lance is very narrow and triangular, and its sides are gradually curving. The ovate is egg-shaped, and it also comes to a point, but it's much shorter and wider than the lance-shaped leaves. And the tongue is generally straight-sided, and it comes to an abrupt tip, and it'll be kind of rounded on top. Now, the Acrocarpus has the lance, ovate, and tongue, and in addition, it has a hair-like shape that's very long and narrow, kind of appearing, like a hair to the human eye. So those are the types of leaf shape. Next slide, please. The third feature is the presence or absence of a midrib in the leaf. It looks like a vein running the length of some of the leaves. Most, but not all Acrocarpus have leaves with midribs. Hair-like and tongue-shaped leaves always have a midrib. And so how to look at, to find the midrib, you want to hold the specimen to allow the light to shine through. And so hold your magnifying glass or something to magnify it, to look at the specimen in front of your eye where it's comfortable, and then move the specimen forward and back and tilt it side to side so that you can see whether there's a line down the middle of the leaf. So you want to hold your magnifying glass still, but move the specimen. So there's some tricky cases. You kind of watch, sometimes the leaves will vertically fold. You kind of have to look for one that's a really nice specimen, look for the very best leaf you can find. And if the leaves are really narrow, sometimes if you look to the base, you can better see that midrib. Next slide, please. Now we're going to take a look at some things that are not mosses, but people often think that they might be, especially because of the way they're named. Spanish moss is one of those. We have some Spanish moss in Arkansas, mostly I think in the Delta region. It is a member of the pineapple family, believe it or not. Spanish moss commonly grows atop southern live oaks, crepe myrtles, or bald cypress. Next slide, please. So this is not a moss. Reindeer moss, and I've seen lots of this up in the village, is a lichen. A lichen describes a synergistic relationship between an algae host that provides the food and its dependent fungus that provides support and shelter. One website I saw was really kind of funny because it said that a lichen is a fungus that has discovered agriculture. So literally, that's what it does. The algae provides food to the moss. Its sugar needs, its nutritional needs, all of that, so that it can survive. And the fungus then provides a structure that the algae can grow on, and so it provides the support and shelter. They grow in open, inhospitable areas on rocks, sides of trees, or bare sand. Next slide, please. This is a club moss. This is not a moss. This is a perennial evergreen vascular plant, and it reproduces via spores similar to ferns. Next slide, please. And this is also not a moss. This is another example of a lichen, and we've got lots of this around hot springs on our trees. Again, it's that synergistic relationship between the algae host that gives it its greenish hue and the fungus, which gives the structure and provides, that outline that you see. Next slide, please. So let's take a look at some that are mosses that you might find in Arkansas. This is Lyle's bristle moss. When growing well, this is a striking plant. It has loose tufts of shoots, 3 to 4 centimeters tall, and it's dusted all over with brown gemme. It grows in a characteristic way on tree trunks. It sprawls downwards and then curves up at the tip. The leaves can be about 3.5 millimeters long. Capsules are rather rare and have curved teeth on them. So just to give you an idea of size of this one, you can see the mosquito that's kind of landed on the moss. It's really tiny there, kind of right at the border in the center of the slide. You can see its form is Acrocarpus, its leaf is a lance leaf, and it does have a midrib. Next slide, please. So this is a train tracks moss. It forms dull mats over tree trunks, or it can be over stone as well. The branches are spreading and erect, and they're densely covered in leaves. And you should look for cylindrical shoots, and the brown fuzz is what attaches it to its substrate, and it kind of looks a lot like a fern. It has trailing stems and tiny leaves that kind of circle around that stem. It's a Pleurocarpus. You can kind of see it branching out. Its leaves are ovate, and it does have a midrib. Next slide, please. It's a pincushion moss. It forms tight clumps that are light blue, gray, or green in color. The clumps, which are often fragile, do not tolerate foot traffic. And when the plant dries out, its color changes from green, that brilliant green that you see there, to a pale whitish green or light blue green that is very distinctive. I found some of this at the movie theater, and I had my husband kind of watch while I scraped up all the moss and put it in the, in the foot area in the car. And so I had to kind of watch where I put my feet so that I could transplant some of that moss that I saw there to my own yard. And I am happy to report that it is doing very well in the little spot that I have it between my stepping stones. Next slide, please. This is Cypress leaf plate moss. It's fairly widespread and abundant. It has irregularly branched, slender to medium shoots, typically about 2 centimeters long. Its leaves are strongly curled and it has a fine point. The shoots are green or tinged with warm brownish color in the older parts. And the capsules are frequent and about 2.5 millimeters long. And it's kind of hard to see, but some of the capsules are shooting up through some of the debris. There's some twig debris that's on there. Its form is Pleurocarpus. It has a sickle leaf and it does not have a midrib. Next slide, please. This one you can see from the picture with the droplets of water. It's a brook canakin moss. It forms in scruffy patches over rocks, frequently in empty stream beds. And then when the water rushes in, it's revived. Lance-shaped leaves are about 2 centimeters long, and the older parts will be brownish. It has cup-like capsules, and they're hidden among the shoot tips. And it really likes those kind of wet habitats. Its form is Acrocarpus. It has a lance-shaped leaf, and it does have a midrib. Next slide, please. And I end with this one. This is the moss that we looked at as we went with Alma on her odyssey through the mysterious world of moss, the yellow yarn moss. Look for these at the bases of tree trunks and calcium-rich rocks. It forms dense mats with upright and irregularly shaped branching. The leaves always look slightly puckered and the branch tips are blunt. It's Pleurocarpus. It has a lance leaf and it does have a midrib. Next slide, please. So here are the references. Wikipedia really has a nice article on moss. I mentioned the Ohio Moss Lichen organization. They are a society that has documented the moss in Ohio. It's an awesome website with some really good pictures, and it kind of chronicles where members of that society have found mosses in different counties in Ohio. So it's really a very interesting site with a lot of really, really good pictures and information about mosses. The next one is a site with some information on garden maintenance. iNaturalist is another great source to find out what mosses are called. You can put a picture in there, and other individuals who participate will look at that picture and help you identify it. So I found that is particularly helpful as well. And then the University of Arkansas also has a resource. There's a nice summary of mosses at that next link, and they gives you kind of an overview of what to do with moss in your yard, how to kind of keep it or not keep it, depending on what you're trying to do. And then I have the reference there for the common mosses of the Northeast and Appalachians. And then there's also a book that the library has called The Magical World of Moss Gardening by Annie Martin. She also is very passionate about mosses, and her book is a really interesting book. I haven't read the whole thing. I've just kind of skimmed through it, but it looks like it's just got some really awesome pictures and some great ideas of how to use mosses in your gardening. So with that, I welcome your questions.
All right. Well, thank you, Jodi. And to anyone watching live, you still have, we did get some comments and questions there, but if anyone still has any while we have time, please get those in. I want to start with a comment from myself, Jodi. You know, as the event coordinator for adults at the library, I you know, have a big array of different topics that I try and book programs for, and of course, not all of them I'm interested in personally myself, but that's not what it's about. And I mean, I love working with the Master Gardeners, but I'm not the target audience for these types of programs. I'm not huge into plants or gardening myself, but I gotta say, this was fascinating. You know, I had no idea moss were so interesting. Can you hear me okay? Jodi? Uh-oh. Can you hear me, Judy? You're muted, Judy.
Here we go.
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay, great.
Okay. Did you hear what I said?
I can't
Jodi?
hear you, Paul.
Well, he said he was fascinated by mosses and he wasn't really a plant person. And that a lot of things don't really hit his hot button with these programs, but he really enjoyed it. I did too. I've not heard your talk before, and I'm like, I can't wait to go out in my yard and start looking at these things and see if I can identify this. I think moss is great, and my dog loves moss. I mean, she loves to walk on it. It's hysterical. She's like, oh, I've got my own little carpet. So anyway, great program.
Thank you.
Can you hear me now, Jodi?
Now I can hear you, Paul.
Okay. Well, after I spilled my heart out.
You did. It was great. You'll have to watch the recording.
Well, Jodi, while you're here, there was a comment for you before I get to the questions for Joe. Let's see, where was it? It was from Stephanie. I thought it was funny. Wow, Jodi, this won't count as a comment, but I've never seen you without dirt on you.
Yeah, Stephanie and I work together at the Hope Garden and several projects together, and we're usually pretty dirty when we get done. It's wonderful. It's wonderful to dig in the dirt.
And before I switch back to just Jodi for the questions, our winners for the prize bags were Dawn, Robert, and Jamie. And how about you remind them what they're winning and when they can get their prizes?
Okay, so it's a little gardening bag, and I usually have one with me to show you, but I don't. I'm sorry. But it's got a little garden tote. It's got a nice garden tool. It'll have some, it's got one of our really cool little earth keychains and another little present in there that you can use in your garden. And I do want to remind everybody, but the library has a book sale, and it goes on all the time. And in the future, what we're going to have in our gift bags is a gardening book of some sort, because I just love our library. They do so much for us, and we have such a wonderful resource there that it's true, that we're going to start incorporating some reading material in our gift bags. So I don't think I'll get that in there tomorrow, but next month with irrigation, we will have some books from the library. And once again, I just thank everybody for joining us. It's such a wonderful thing to be able to be with everybody, and then go back if you want to look at the Moss program again, or tell a friend about it. I think everything is really, well, I've said enough, but I think we have a great library. This program has been great. I appreciate Jodi, and your gift bags will be at the library after 12 noon tomorrow.
All right, thank you, Jodi. Let's see. All right, so let's start with some questions I got over email. Then we'll move on to the live audience ones. So first of all, what kind of lens should you use to look at mosses?
Okay, use one that you can hold on to easily, anywhere from 7 to 20 times. You want to be able to kind of see the moss in its environment, and then close up to be able to look at the leaves.
Do deer eat moss?
No, that's the really cool thing about moss. It has chemicals in it, and it is not nutritious, right, to things that would normally eat it. In fact, it's antibacterial, antifungal, and it's been used to dress wounds. There are cases where reindeer do eat some moss, but they use it more like an antifreeze, and it's kind of something that they eat only during certain times when they need certain things, certain chemicals, in their bodies. So it's kind of just really an interesting thing that it's not really a food for anything.
Mm-hmm. And then they eat the reindeer moss, which isn't actually a moss.
Exactly. They do eat reindeer moss, especially way up north.
My yard has a lot of shade. In the past several years, had an invasion of moss, especially in the more shady areas. How do I get rid of it?
Yeah, well, since it is a shady area, you probably want to keep the moss, because grass doesn't really grow very well without sunlight. But if your heart is set on having some sort of grass, you need to have a grass that will grow in the shade. And then there's something going on there where plants won't grow. The moss is more of an opportunist instead of something that, that kind of takes over an area like an invasive would. So there's some sort of amendment that probably needs to be done under those trees. And then you need to have a grass that will grow in shaded areas.
Is moss harmful to trees?
No, moss is not harmful to trees at all, because remember, its root system, it just hangs on. It's not taking nutrients from the tree, or it's not prying itself into the tree like some of the vines that you'll see, like wisteria and other vines that kind of grab at the tree. Moss is just kind of resting there, and a lot of times it kind of masks other problems that you may have in your environment.
I'll throw in a spin-off of that question. Is there anything that people confuse as a moss, maybe a fungus, that would be harmful to trees?
Yeah, potentially, because a fungus, right, is breaking down the tree. That's why you see it on decaying logs and such. A moss doesn't do that. A moss is really, again, an opportunist. It looks for a substrate that it can grab onto in an environment where it gets the moisture and the sunlight that it needs.
Here's a good one that you always hear. Does moss always grow on the north side of trees?
No, right? And especially if you're in the southern hemisphere. A lot of times moss tends to be on the north side of a tree because of the environment that's there, right? Because it's a shaded kind of area and it traps the moisture on that north side because of the way the sun kind of moves through the sky. You see how you always want a southern exposure, right, to grow plants. Now, in the southern hemisphere, the moss actually tends to grow on the south side of trees. So you kind of have to think about what the moss needs to grow and thrive versus some kind of rule of thumb.
And last one from the email questions. How do you propagate moss? I've heard that buttermilk, beer, or yogurt helps.
Yeah. Not so much really. Again, remember that moss gets most of its nutrients from the air and from the moisture in the air and the minerals carried in the air. So really the way I've transplanted moss is kind of like I described when I brought some of that moss home from the movie theater. If you just kind of scrape up underneath it and then move it to the environment, that's where it gets a little tricky, right? Because it wants to grow in the microclimate that it's accustomed to. And so you may or may not have that microclimate in all of the areas of your yard. So you have to kind of understand what the moss needs. So transplanting that moss is the best way to do it. The buttermilk thing, the deal with that is that it provides maybe a way to slather it onto something that is odd shaped. That's about the only useful thing that I found with the buttermilk, because the spores will actually grow and reproduce on their own. They don't need the buttermilk.
All right, I'm going to move on to the live audience questions.
Okay.
And so last call, if anyone's watching still has any. First of all, I got a comment from Dawn. Glad to be here and thanks for this programming. You're welcome, Dawn. Thanks for tuning in. Robert says, I love plants, but I seem to have a dark purple or black thumb when it comes to keeping anything alive for more than a month or so. I'm hoping moss might be hardier.
Yes, in the right environment, absolutely. Especially because moss doesn't really die, it just goes dormant. So when it's brown, it means it just hasn't gotten the moisture that it needs. Obviously, in the last couple of days, we've had plenty of moisture. So you'll see lots of moss.
Jamie asks, does moss transplant easy? I have tons by the creek.
Yeah, but given that it's by the creek, it probably likes that moist environment. So the place you're transplanting it to, it's all about reproducing that environment that it's accustomed to. So it absolutely does transplant easy as long as you're transplanting it to a similar microclimate.
Regine, thank you for watching, says, I'm about 30% into converting to a moss lawn.
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it. And to kind of encourage that, kind of remove debris and allow it to spread gradually. You might even do a little bit of transplanting. Start small and kind of allow the moss to lead you through the best way to plant your moss lawn.
John asked, do insects like to live or hide in the mosses?
Not so much. You think about ticks, right? And those kind of things. They want to be up close to where their host is going to brush against them. Mosses are so low to the ground that it doesn't provide them that opportunity. They're so short too that mosquitoes, they're looking for a place to get out of the wind. Well, the moss doesn't provide any wind barrier at all. So really, there's not really a huge environment for those types of critters, to use the moss as a sheltering place.
A couple questions from Robert. In the village, I see a lot of slate greenish gray balls of what I thought are moss. Is it the reindeer moss rather than regular moss?
It's the reindeer moss, yeah.
Also asks, can moss rescued from outside be coaxed to grow indoors? Rescued in quotations.
Yeah, I haven't had a whole lot of growing moss indoors, but you probably could. Again, given, if you just kind of keep that kind of moist environment, it would have to be misted. I would actually try it in a terrarium type setting. I think that would be where it would be most successful.
Regine asked, is there a suggestion for determining whether, am I pronouncing this right, sphagnum moss is sustainably produced?
You kind of have to just understand how whatever company is harvesting it, what they're doing. It's easier sometimes just to kind of dig it all up, and what you really kind of need to do is like give it a little bit of a haircut, because the sphagnum moss, the way it grows is it has a stalk, and on the end of that stalk are like these three clusters. Actually, it's just usually an odd number, 3 to 7 clusters of like little mop-like heads. So if you cut off those mop-like heads, then it can be reproduced. But if you dig up the entire plant, and that should be listed in the company's, kind of processing background.
Jodi with a Y says, I have tried to identify mosses in naturalists before to a limited degree. Are you part of any groups on it? I've only found one interested in indigenous species.
I've dabbled with iNaturalist, but I haven't really gotten too into it. When I heard Karen Willard speak, that was just really inspiring to me. She's thinking of writing a book about Arkansas moss and helping people to identify that. So I think I'll probably become a little bit more active. And there is a moss Facebook page with Arkansas. So if you look for moss in Arkansas, there is a Facebook group page.
James asks, aren't mosses some of the most extreme weather plants in the world, like in the far north, up mountains, far south, etc.?
Yeah, with over 12,000 species, they grow everywhere. Everywhere has mosses. It's just kind of a matter of, how it's found its niche in that environment. And it grows in pretty inhospitable places.
Just saw a comment from Dawn, who's watching from Missouri, who had won one of the bags. So I'm going to give it to the next person since she can't get it. But thank you for watching, Dawn. So we had Robert, Jamie, and now Regine. You've won Dawn's bag. So congrats, Regine. Jodi with a Y again. Are there any resources for details regarding transplanting and cultivating mosses that you recommend?
There was a video that I watched on transplanting mosses, and it's a relatively simple procedure. I mean, it really is just about kind of scraping underneath that rhizome, and kind of pressing that little carpeted piece into the cleared kind of earth where you want to put it. If you, I think it was Moss Acres, something like that. There's a gentleman that does a lot with mosses. I really didn't feature him, but he does have a video on that. You just search for that.
One thing that seems pretty popular on YouTube are the little miniature ecosystems, the ecospheres, and people I notice use moss a lot in them. Do you have any recommendations for anyone interested in that?
I haven't done that, but again, I think in a terrarium setting where you can kind of ensure that there's a a constant level of moisture, that would probably, that'd probably be pretty interesting experiment.
You know of any little invertebrates that would be really compatible in a moss terrarium?
There aren't any. Moss is almost, it's doesn't contribute to any specific wildlife or insects, again, because they don't eat it. I mean, so it's kind of almost like, gravel in the bottom of a, of a
It's
terrarium.
Robert asked, when transplanting moss, does it still need a fine layer of soil if it is placed on a?
No, it doesn't really need soil at all. It just needs something that it can kind of put its little rhizomes into, so it gives itself a stable and constant environment. It's more important that it gets enough sunlight and enough moisture. And so when you transplant the moss, you may need to just kind of watch for whether it needs additional moisture. Because remember, it grew in a place where it was really happy. I mean, it found the moisture it needed, the sunshine it needed, and it wasn't in a place where it was too windy. So when you transplant it, you have to kind of make sure you're reproducing those environmental factors, and that will go a long way to determining how well the moss does.
All three of us got a thank you from Cindy, so you're welcome, Cindy, and thank you for watching. All right, well, unless anyone has anything last minute to throw in there while we're live, I'm going to give you, Jodi, an opportunity to give us any final remarks you'd like to share.
Absolutely. Thank you for watching and journeying with me into the wonderful world of moss. I am just fascinated by these tiny little structures. I see them everywhere I go, and looking forward to getting better at identifying them. For me, that's if I can name it, I feel like I can own it a little bit. And so it gives me a little ownership there. I want to encourage people to get out into the yards, get out into nature. Try and leave the mosses that are in the national park where they are. Parking lots and those kind of places are the places you can really harvest moss, or a friend's yard. But please leave the indigenous moss that's growing in our national parks to grow where it's growing. I encourage you to continue watching the programs here at the library that the Master Gardeners offer. And if you're interested in Master Gardening, by all means, stop by the Extension office and pick up an application. Our meetings are open to the public. We meet the third Thursdays of every month. We're doing those meetings via Zoom right now, but we hope to meet in person over the summer like everyone else. And again, thank you for watching. Thank you for your interest in mosses, and get out there and find them.
And I want to thank the Master Gardeners too for providing some small potted plants to the library. That we've put them in the staff area, but the public, you can just walk right by and see them. They have some little info sheets, and everyone that walks by has commented on them, and they've brought some beauty to the library. So we appreciate that.
Green is good.
Yeah. Did a few last minute comments, so I'll read those off, even though you've said your final spiel. Jodi, thank you for your insight. Stephanie says, after I heard you present on moss once before, I went out on my property and located several that you talked about and became fascinated with them and enjoyed watching the changes in them throughout the seasons. I would think they were dead during really dry spells, and then magically after rain, they were back.
Mm-hmm.
James, thanks you for your wisdom and experience. Regine says, I find using a leaf blower helps keep them clean.
Yep.
And distributes fractions that can then grow in new spots. All right. Well, thank you, Jodi, and thank you everyone for watching. Like I said in the beginning, this broadcast was recorded, so there may be a small delay between the recording and it being posted on the library's Facebook and YouTube channels, but it'll be there to watch indefinitely and share with your friends, or refer back to if you ever need to. There will be direct links you can share. And our next Master Gardeners program, like Jodi had said, is Tuesday, June 22nd. That one's on irrigation. And that one, most of our programs are in the evening, but that one just so happens is going to be broadcast during the day, or a little bit earlier. So you can check our calendar online and our social media for more info about that, and we'll make a special announcement for it soon with the exact time. And of course, we'll have several programs between now and then of all kinds of topics. So once again, thank you for watching, and thank you, Jodi, and thank you, Judy, and thank you, Master Gardeners. Everyone, have a good night.
Thank you.